Brilliant. So I'm here with Colin Campbell and we are talking about cultivating the diviner. So Colin, are you able to just give us the essence of who the diviner is?
Thank you, Rachel. Well, it's tricky to give an essence of something as big as that, because we're talking about a very huge subject here. And I think the first problem we sit with is this word diviner and divination, because in English, the assumption we have when we use the word divine and diviner is God, that we're somehow communicating directly with God, or that it's the word of God that everything's God. God is creation. So the diviner and divination doesn't differentiate as essentially some sort of direct communication with the divine, because everything is divine and everything is a connection and communication with the divine. So I think it's useful to kind of pull that word aside a little bit. And I would almost say that divination, and we're always going to struggle, because when we are making the transition from one cognitive system based in one cultural framework or cosmology to another, it's very difficult. We have to kind of juggle and play with words, and particularly when we're working with English, which unfortunately, when it comes to mythos, English is very good with logos. It's not as good with mythos, unfortunately, in my experience. So when we're making these translations, we have to try and find words that are usefully able, if you like, to make that translation. So instead of using the word diviner, I would tend to use the word tracker. And to understand tracking as something much broader than the simple understanding of, say, following an animal's footprints, or as a hunter might. It's tracking is a way of paying attention in a very particular way, and then out of that, recognizing a narrative, a story, and finding meaning and pulling things together in a narrative sense. So one of the things we can understand is that when, for example, when a San people are the first people here in Southern Africa, the hunter-gatherer nations, who used to be here and who used to live as hunter-gatherers, most of whom, in fact, pretty much all of whom don't anymore. But they are very famous for their hunting skills. And when they go hunting, they have this extraordinary capacity to track. And when we ask ourselves, well, what does that actually mean? Does that mean they're sort of good at seeing the footprints on the ground? Yes, they are good at seeing the footprints on the ground, but much, much, much more than that. Within a sand tracker's internal consciousness is a representation of the entirety, if this can be believed, of their external environment, of the world in which they live. And when they track, they go into that world as much as they go out into the world around them. And they have different ways of coming into states of what I would call knowing. So they track by looking at the way footprints are shown on the ground. They track by listening to the sounds that birds are making. They track by following the particular quality and the nature of the wind. They track by looking at the sky and its particular hue and color and frame. They track by looking at the plants and the way the plants are and the way things have moved and changed. So they have a whole way of paying attention to the entirety of the internal as well as the external environment, which are in a sense a continuum. And that tracking is both, we would use words like intuitive. I don't particularly like the word intuitive, fundamentally because intuition it's a very reduced word. It's a kind of, it's so much bigger than that. And yet in English, we have to use that word to kind of begin to enter into something of an understanding of what this immersion into their internal sense of knowing implies. The first aspect of knowing has to do with intimate relationship. So you could say, if we're going to use this word tracker stroke diviner, that a diviner cultivates an intimate, a deeply intimate relationship with the environment within which they find themselves, with their territory, you could say. And their territory is both their living territory as it is outside, and a living territory within themselves, and the embodiment of a cosmology within which they are submerged. And the task of the tracker, the task of the diviner, if you want to call it that, is to be consistently in a state of interactive connection with every aspect of that territory. And in so doing, finding their way into different parts. And one of the things that they're particularly tasked with is monitoring balance, because there's balances between everything. So the way things interact in the outer world, the way things interact in the inner world, the way things interact in the community, the way things interact in the entirety of their experience has a balance to it. And their task is to look for places where that balance is in some way slightly out or not completely in sync with the rest of balance. And by bringing attention to it, there's a way in which that balance can potentially be restored. So divination is not just the position of finding what is out of balance, but it's also the act of bringing attention to where that imbalance is in such a way that the imbalance is rectified and balance is restored. So this is done as an individual. It's done then as the individual within the totality of the environment, and it's done as the individual within the context of community. And so there are a number of interfaces that happen within that territory. So there's the interface between the human world, for example, and the rest of nature. There's the interface. There's the interface between land and water. There's the interface between earth and sky. There's the interface between what is seen and what is not seen. So all those realms that we don't have access to in our physical senses have interfaces with the physical world. The diviner's task is to be aware of all of these interfaces and to be managing the balance, the relative balance between them. That is as closely as I can get in a very short, brief form to a description of something of what a diviner is. It's a very big subject. And I mean, the task before us when we go into deeply exploring this question of the diviner is to somehow over time really open out the massive array of what this word that we use, divination, what it actually means, and what it means to not just understand it, but to have a relationship with that part of ourselves.
Wow, that's great, Colin. So I've suddenly, realised exactly what our task is. And we will obviously be tackling it over the next few weeks, few months. But I just wondered at this moment then, before we step in, what do you think the chances are of us here in the West that actually have lost so many of those internal and external relationships to be able to kind of come back into this realm of the diviner? Do you think, so we talked about San people being able to do that, naturally in hunting. Do you think there's a way of us being able to return to that state?
Well, I mean, I think again, that's a multi-level, multi-layered question insofar as there are a lot of different ways that we might come at that as an exploration. The straight answer to you is I don't know. But underlying that is a belief in me that says, I'm pretty sure we can. And that's undergirded by a sense that the diviner in us has never gone away. It's part of an archetypal aspect of our nature. It's an archetypal aspect of our collective. The archetypes don't go away. But what does happen is we lose connection with them, potentially. And the extent to which we've lost connection with the natural world, we've also lost connection with a vast array, a vast spectrum of our own nature within. Now, again, I'm using the word lost here, but it's not so much that we've lost them, it's that we've disconnected from them and that they've gone unconscious on us. And so if we were to say, okay, well, let's see how we can activate the diviner in us, the archetype of the diviner in us. And in activating it, what we begin to do is to start paying attention. And what we know, even in a Western world view of psychology and so on, is that when you pay attention to something, it comes back into consciousness. It reemerges. It's activated within consciousness. So, which of course, again, is what the diviner does. So in that sense, if we recognize at this point that the great imbalance of the Western world is that we've lost touch with that archetype very deeply within us, then paying attention to that archetype is already embodying the diviner, because the diviner would say, well, there's the imbalance, let's pay attention to it. And in paying attention, we begin to track it. We begin to see it. We begin to follow the threads that lead us back into that archetypal place within ourselves. And we begin to reactivate into waking consciousness a relationship with it. And it's going to ask a lot of us. It's going to ask of us to reacquaint ourselves with aspects of our nature that we've kind of left dormant for, well, in some cases, millennia, depending on the cultural framework. It's going to ask of us to rediscover very, very deep, intimate relationship with who we are and where we are and what we find ourselves in. But already what we're doing when we're doing that is we are activating, we are interacting with, we are mobilizing the diviner in that process. So right from the start, we're activating the diviner when we start this tracking business, when we start this business of paying attention to this imbalance that has turned up in our way of being in this present time, this disconnect that has happened, which is essentially what imbalance is, the result of a disconnect in some form or other. There's a disjunct of some kind. And that's really what the diviner seeks out. Where is that disjunct, and where are the different permutations of it, and how do we begin to pay attention to them in such a way that they become reactivated? And so there's a deep part of me that says, well, if we persist at this, and if we do this right from the start, we'll be divining, if you like to use that word, or we'll be tracking, and that tracking will lead us to the diviner, and that will lead to a reactivation, a conscious reactivation of the diviner. The diviner is obviously active in us. It's just not necessarily conscious. It's either semi-conscious or in some cases pretty much unconscious. It's there. We just need to reactivate our conscious awareness, our conscious connection to it. And I do believe that's fully possible.
Fantastic. And in the preparation for our time together, obviously we want to ask people to start tracking.
Yes.
Can you give just the essence of what people should really be looking out for in their preparations? What aspects should they?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of, hopefully we're going to be working with lots of techniques in the long run. So I'm going to try and think up some very preliminary ones as we sit here now. I mean, I think the first one is just the idea that this archetype lives within us, the diviner. The diviner is very closely related to, and it forms part of the archetype of the magician within us. They're kind of not quite one and the same thing. One is a permutation of the other. So you could say that the diviner is a permutation of the magician. A fundament of the magician's task is tracking, and insofar as the magician is in the tracking mode, the magician is in that sense being the diviner. So you find that in most cultures, these two are very, very deeply related. So I think our first task would be to say, okay, let's hold the idea that the diviner is not something we're setting out to acquire. It's not knowledge that we're off to seek. It's something inherently within the nature of who we are, within the nature of the collective to whom we belong, and within the nature of nature itself, within which we are still immersed, despite the fact that we may be living in a city. So as we start to hold that as a possibility, focus in on that, already we're paying attention in a tracking sense. We're beginning to track the diviner in us. And what will start happening is there will start to be movements in us that lead us into towards a relationship with, or towards re-establishing contact with a conscious relationship with the diviner within ourselves. And later that leads to practices, and it leads to, okay, so once we've kind of established that there's this diviner, and once we've established that there's, that we can begin the process of bringing the diviner into conscious interaction, with dynamic interaction with ourselves, with us, then what are the practices that come in? And then at that point, we begin to look at, well, first of all, there's the question of meaning and the recognition that as human beings, we're imaginal, first of all. That means we work in image predominantly. And we find ways of drawing images together, and we find ways of tracking into images and finding meaning in those images, which ends up being story or narrative. So one of the things, and we all do this, so a lot of what we tend to do in the modern world is, we might walk around and you hear somebody saying, oh, so-and-so had a, they had a really nasty experience this morning. They trapped their finger in the door. And then somebody might say, oh, I wonder what that, of course it's awful and dreadful, but I wonder what that means. Does it have a meaningful place in the narrative of what's going on for them? The moment you ask that question, essentially you're entering into divination. You're entering into the realm of the diviner. The diviner is interested not just in the, phenomenological experience of awfulness that happens when you crush your finger in a door, but the diviner is interested in why. Is there some way in which that incident finds relationship with other incidents around it, with other experiences around it, somehow clusters in to form a narrative of meaning? And the diviner's task, the tracker's task, is to pull that narrative out and present it either to themselves or to the other or to the community. That's what they do. And then we have tools, of course, to do that. We won't worry so much about that now, but rather just to be thinking about this as you come, and maybe writing into it as well. It might be useful, because writing is always a good way of slowing down the thinking process. Thinking, it's very ephemeral, it's fast. But as soon as you start writing things down, so when something happens, you write it down, and then you sit down quietly and you think into it in writing, and you say, well, this happened or that happened, and are there other incidents that like it that have happened recently? Are there, what feelings went with it? Did I have any dreams recently? Are there clusters of information around it that begin to impart some sense of the meaning of that event? And once we do that, we're tracking. So it might be a good start to kind of, first of all, believe that the diviner is already there. You're not looking for somebody who is somewhere else. You're not trying to find a diviner out there. What you're trying to do is become conscious of the diviner within yourself and within your collective, because we have the divination, the archetype of the diviner or the tracker is within all of us. It's part of being human. But what has happened is we've kind of encapsulated ourselves in this very secularized, very kind of restricted, very narrowed down version of what being human means. And so in doing that, we've partitioned ourselves off from a lot of conscious access to these deep archetypes, the archetype of the magician, the archetype of the lover, the archetype of the diviner, the sovereign, and so on. So, we can begin to track them by saying, yes, they exist, and where can I begin to feel a sense of their presence? So in the case of the diviner tracker, what we're going to start doing is tracking the narrative in the events of our daily experience. So what is the story? These aren't just random events. We're going to suspend our view in Western culture that things kind of just happen because they happen. And we're going to say, things happen because they are meaningful. And that's a fundamental shift into the diviner awareness. The diviner holds this belief that everything is meaningful. Nothing has no meaning. And so the question of tracking then is, what is that meaning? And how does that meaning apply? And how can I orient myself in relation to that meaning?
Fantastic. Thank you, Colin. So that will be our homework for the time between now and we are together. So I will also put that in writing for people so you can see exactly what to do. But that's wonderful, Colin. Thank you for that context. And we will look forward to seeing you at the end of May.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to it too very much.